Long before the metallic whisper of currency, before kings pressed their likenesses into shining discs, before markets clattered with the sound of measured worth, there was only the hush of need and the quiet rhythm of exchange born from survival. Picture, if you will, a landscape without money, no coins, no ledgers, no scales of silver or bars of gold, only hands, eyes, and memories. In the dim light of prehistory, when the world was still heavy with mist and silence, people met not as merchants, but as beings bound by hunger and trust. One carried grain, the other flint. They regarded each other through the language of gesture, a glance toward the basket, a nod toward the blade. And somewhere in that stillness, between offer and acceptance, between giving and receiving, value was born, not written, not counted, but felt. To barter was not simply to trade, it was to recognize another's existence, to acknowledge that one's own abundance could soothe another's lack. This was the first moral act of humanity, the awareness that something you possess could become something shared. Yet the world before coins was not a simple Eden of goodwill. Beneath each gift lingered a shadow, the weight of obligation. To give was to create a bond, a small and invisible tether that could last for seasons, even lifetimes. Among early tribes, the memory of who gave and who received was sacred, it bound the group together through invisible debts. Every exchange became a thread woven into the social fabric, and to break that thread through deceit or forgetfulness was to court chaos. Imagine an early settlement where huts huddled close to a river's bend. A hunter returns from the forest with the carcass of a deer, its blood steaming in the cold air. He shares the meat freely, and his neighbors murmur gratitude. But they know, though no one says it, that they now owe him something. Not today, perhaps not even this season, but someday, when the hunter's traps are empty and his children hungry, they must remember. Memory was the first currency, and debt the first invisible coin. In that fragile balance of giving and owing, early humans constructed a moral economy, a quiet, intricate system in which fairness was not measured by scales but by conscience. Anthropologists once tried to imagine primitive barter as a crude market. One person offers eggs, another offers tools, and both agree on an equal trade. But the truth, drawn from the oldest societies we know, is far more haunting and subtle. Real barter, before the abstraction of price, was rarely about equivalence. It was a conversation in action, a slow negotiation of need, reputation, and reciprocity. To trade was to enter into relationship. Every item held a story, every gesture contained a trace of trust or suspicion. What was exchanged was not merely an object but a fragment of the self. Close your eyes and listen, the murmur of a Neolithic village, the rustle of straw, the crackle of fire. Two figures kneel by a hearth, one offering salt gathered from the distant sea, the other grain from the river plains. The salt tastes of storms and foam, the grain smells of warmth and earth. They do not count, for there are no numbers yet, only the rhythm of giving and taking, of gratitude and expectation. The salt passes from hand to hand, a sacred moment of transfer, and with it comes the unspoken vow that balance will be maintained. In the absence of writing, memory must suffice. Each person becomes a living ledger, carrying the knowledge of who owes whom, of when gifts were given and when they must be returned. To forget such things is not mere carelessness, it is a kind of social death. The further one travels back, the more mysterious this ancient commerce becomes. In some early cultures, exchange took place not through direct barter, but through elaborate ritual. The act of trading was transformed into ceremony, a sacred performance that transcended the goods themselves. Among the tribes that would later inhabit the Pacific Islands, for example, the ceremonial exchange of necklaces and armbands in vast circular routes, known to anthropologists as the Kula ring, revealed a truth older than history, that value lives not in possession, but in movement. Each object, passed from hand to hand across hundreds of miles, became charged with spiritual significance, a vessel of prestige and continuity. The red shell necklaces traveled clockwise, the white armbands counterclockwise, forming a vast, invisible current of mutual recognition. To refuse to give was to halt that current, to deny the pulse of community itself. It is this same current that flowed through the earliest human settlements long before the word market was ever spoken. In the valleys of Mesopotamia, in the shadow of ziggurats not yet built, villagers exchanged tools, grain, pottery, and favor through trust alone. The first trade routes were not roads of commerce, but paths of memory, trails worn by repetition, where one family knew the next, where each handshake was both transaction and promise. There were no coins to fix value, so value itself breathed and shifted like the wind. A single jar might be worth a dozen fish one season, and half that the next, depending on rain, famine, or fortune. And in this instability lay the seed of the idea that would one day define civilization, that value could be abstracted, stabilized, represented. But in those first quiet centuries, abstraction was still a distant dream. The barterer's world was immediate, tactile, filled with the scent of goods and the texture of trust. It was a world of obligation, of moral tension as much as material need. A gift could unite or enslave. To receive too much generosity was dangerous, for it created a debt that might never be repaid. The earliest stories of humanity, the myths sung by firesides, often warned of those who took without giving, who disturbed the balance and called down the wrath of spirits or ancestors. Trade was never purely economic, it was spiritual, social, psychological. To barter was to participate in the eternal cycle of reciprocity that kept the world itself in harmony. And yet, as societies grew larger, as strangers began to meet beyond the limits of kinship, barter began to strain under its own weight. How could trust survive when one no longer knew the other's face? When memory could no longer hold the web of obligations that spread across villages and valleys? In this growing complexity, we find the early glimmer of accounting, the first clay tokens of Mesopotamia, small, simple markers of grain, cattle, or oil sealed within clay envelopes to record promises. These tokens were not yet money, but they carried its ghost, a way to make memory tangible. Each token whispered, "I remember for you." Still, even as abstraction began to emerge, the ancient moral tension endured. For every trade, whether with words, goods, or symbols, required faith that the other would honor the unseen balance. In ancient Anatolia, obsidian blades were traded over vast distances, each one a shard of black glass reflecting both craftsmanship and trust. Archaeologists have found these blades hundreds of miles from their volcanic source, evidence of exchange networks that must have relied not on written contracts, but on mutual recognition. To hold an obsidian blade was to hold a piece of another's world, to feel the touch of distant hands and the shimmer of unseen relationships. This intimacy of exchange, its emotional resonance, is something we have almost forgotten in our modern world of price tags and credit cards. Yet in those primordial transactions, every trade carried emotional gravity. To give away one's harvest was to surrender a piece of one's labor, one's time, one's self. To receive another's craft was to take in their story, their skill, their spirit. The line between economic and spiritual exchange blurred until the two were one. And in that blending, barter became sacred. The first temples were not banks, not yet, but they emerged from the same impulse, the desire to stabilize the exchange between human and divine. Sacrifice, after all, is merely barter at its most exalted form, an offering given in hope of divine favor, a trade between the seen and the unseen. So as we drift through the mists of prehistory, we find the same pattern repeating: to exchange is to connect is to owe, and to owe is to live in balance with others. The barter world was fragile, yes, but it was also profoundly human. It demanded empathy, patience, memory, traits that coins would later render unnecessary. But something was lost in that transition. When money arrived, it freed us from dependence on others, from the tension of personal obligation. Yet it also severed the emotional root of exchange. The ancient barterer did not trade with strangers, he traded with the known, the familiar, the trusted. To trade was to reaffirm belonging. And still, somewhere in the depths of time, one can sense the anxiety that haunted even the simplest exchange. What if the gift was not reciprocated? What if the memory of debt turned to resentment? What if the balance broke? These questions haunted the human mind long before coinage, and they birthed customs of ritualized giving designed to neutralize envy and preserve peace. In some early communities, lavish feasts, like the potlatch of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, served precisely this purpose: to give so generously that no one could question the host's status or goodwill. Such rituals echoed the earliest barters, amplifying their spiritual tension to a collective scale. Every society, it seems, built its stability upon the delicate art of exchange. And so we return to that first moment, two figures in the dusk, trading something necessary for something desired. Their exchange is small, almost invisible, yet in it lies the entire future of human civilization. For from that gesture of offering and acceptance would come the rise of markets, the birth of debt, the invention of currency, and eventually, the vast architectures of finance and empire. But here, in the stillness before all that, we can sense the purity of the act itself, the quiet recognition of mutual need, the fragile faith that value can be shared, the invisible thread tying one soul to another through the act of giving. If you listen closely, beyond the noise of modernity, you can still hear it, the faint, timeless murmur of barter, the whisper of hands exchanging meaning before money gave it a name. It is the sound of the first economy, the breath of trust that built the world. And as we drift deeper into this ancient silence, we might realize that the story of value is not about coins or wealth, but about the memory of fairness, the ghost of reciprocity that lingers in us still, reminding us that before we measured worth, we measured one another. Before there were markets, there were moments, small, nearly imperceptible gestures that passed between living beings. A hand extending food to another, a tool lent and later returned, a seed shared at planting time. These were not transactions as we understand them, but the quiet beginnings of something more intricate, the architecture of trust. The first exchanges were not about profit, nor were they calculated acts of fairness. They were about survival, yes, but also about acknowledgement, about the recognition of the other as a being worthy of sharing. In this recognition lay the first moral act of human society, and with it, the birth of an invisible economy made not of things, but of memory. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss, thousands of years after those first offerings, would call it the gift, a system of mutual giving and receiving that preceded and shaped all economic life. But long before the idea was named, it was lived. Imagine the earliest human settlements, clusters of families bound by blood and firelight, where to hoard was to endanger the group and to share was to preserve it. Food moved from hand to hand, not because it was measured, but because it was needed. The rhythm of giving became the pulse of survival itself. Over time, this rhythm grew into ritual, and ritual into expectation. To give became not just kindness, but obligation, a social duty that held the fragile unity of the group in place. It is said that the first gifts were not material at all, but gestures, a piece of labor, a song, a watchful presence at night while others slept. The value of such acts could not be tallied, it existed only in the memory of the receiver. From these earliest exchanges, an unspoken rule emerged: one must return what one receives, not always in kind, but in spirit. This rule, the law of reciprocity, was perhaps the first law humanity ever obeyed. Long before kings proclaimed decrees, long before scribes etched codes into stone, the law of the gift guided the living. To take without giving back was to break the order of the world. Yet the simplicity of this moral code concealed a growing complexity. For every gift carried a double weight, gratitude and debt. To give was to elevate oneself in the eyes of others, but it was also to bind them. The receiver, however grateful, became obligated; the giver, however generous, became powerful. Across cultures, this tension gave rise to rituals of equalization, systems of return designed to keep social balance intact. In the Arctic, a hunter who caught too many seals would distribute them freely, ensuring the community's survival and his own honor. But should he refuse to share, the spirits of the hunt would turn against him, and misfortune would follow. The lesson was clear: the universe itself seemed to enforce reciprocity. This idea, that every act of giving carried cosmic consequence, was not confined to myth. It lived in practice, in the quiet exchanges that built the first human relationships. The potter who offered her vessels to the hunter in exchange for meat did not merely swap goods, she entered into a compact of mutual remembrance. Tomorrow, she might need sinew for her tools or help in the fields, and the hunter would remember. Memory became the first marketplace, stored not in clay or metal, but in the folds of the mind. The strength of a community depended upon how well it could remember, and how faithfully it could balance the moral books of giving and receiving. But memory is fragile. It bends under time, under absence, under resentment. What happens when the gift is forgotten? When the return never comes? The ancient world grappled with this question not in writing, but in ritual. Among the early tribes of the Levant, gifts were sealed with oaths before the ancestors. The exchange was witnessed by the dead, who, though silent, were believed to record every act of generosity and greed. To violate a gift was to offend not just the living, but the unseen, the lineage that watched and judged. Thus, barter, even in its earliest form, was always haunted. In this haunting, we glimpse the first shadow of what would later become interest, debt, taxation, but in its beginning, it was something more intimate. The gift created a cycle that could never truly end. To repay exactly what one received was to sever the bond. True reciprocity required imbalance, a small excess, a surplus of gratitude, to keep the relationship alive. In this way, early human communities developed a kind of emotional economy, one that thrived on the gentle asymmetry of kindness. Each gift called for another, and another, in a chain of generosity that could last generations. Yet not all gifts were given freely. Some were traps disguised as kindness. Among certain tribes, an overly generous offering could humiliate the receiver, forcing them into a lifetime of repayment. The anthropological record is filled with stories of feasts so lavish that guests were ruined by their obligation to match them. What began as generosity could become domination. To control another's debt was to control their dignity. Thus, beneath the graceful language of the gift lay the first stirrings of power. Power is the silent twin of generosity. The one who gives defines the relationship, for to give is to decide who receives. And in deciding that, one establishes hierarchy. The chief who distributes goods among his people is not only benevolent, he is sovereign. He becomes the center of the circle of exchange, the living measure of fairness. It is not difficult to see in this dynamic the earliest seeds of governance, of authority, of divine kingship. In the beginning, leadership may have grown not from conquest, but from generosity, from the ability to give more than one takes. As societies grew, these patterns crystallized. The communal act of exchange became more structured, more symbolic. Feasts were held to reaffirm alliances. Gifts were offered to cement marriages or to heal old wounds. Each act of giving became a language of diplomacy, spoken in the syntax of objects. A carved figurine, a bracelet of bone, a handful of grain, all bore meanings beyond their use. The objects themselves were less important than the web of relationships they maintained. We tend to imagine barter as an impersonal trade, one good for another, but this is a modern fiction. In the earliest world, no trade was impersonal. Every exchange carried emotional resonance, every object a trace of its giver. The anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, who lived among the islanders of the South Pacific, observed that gifts were never mere things, they were extensions of the self. When a man passed a necklace to another, he passed a fragment of his identity. That necklace would then travel onward, carrying the aura of each hand that had held it. The same was true in pre-monetary ages. To own an object was to inherit its story. To trade it was to pass on one's memory. Consider how this concept of living value might have shaped early life. A stone tool given by a friend carried more than utility, it carried sentiment. It was a reminder of connection. Losing it could feel like betrayal. To possess it too long without reciprocation might become a source of shame. And so, objects moved, not just across distances, but through emotions, through the moral air of the community. This motion of value, this circulation of memory, was what kept societies alive. It was not markets that first bound humanity together, but obligations, invisible, enduring, and profoundly personal. To trace the first exchanges, then, is to trace the earliest psychology of debt. And debt, in this ancient sense, was not a number. It was a feeling, a weight on the heart that could only be lifted through action. One owed not a specific quantity, but a gesture, an acknowledgement, an equal moment of humanity in return. Debt was spiritual long before it was financial. And perhaps, even now, it remains so, hidden beneath the arithmetic of modern life. For every act of giving still contains the echo of that first, unrecorded trade, the one conducted not with coins, but with conscience. As night settles over the imagined past, we can almost see those first barterers, sitting by a fire, their faces lit by flame, their voices low as they exchange tools, food, and promises. The world around them is vast and unknowable, but in the act of trading, they create a small circle of order, a fragile certainty that meaning can be shared. In that circle, we see the embryo of every future economy, every market, every contract written in law. But theirs is softer, slower, almost sacred, a rhythm of giving and remembering that breathes in time with the seasons. And perhaps, as you drift in the sound of this history, you might sense that these first exchanges were not merely economic at all, but existential. To give and to receive is to affirm the self in the mirror of another. It is to say, you and I exist in the same world, and through this act, we recognize each other. Before coins, before written law, before temples counted offerings, this recognition was all humanity had, and it was enough to build the first societies. There is something profoundly human about the memory of an exchange, not the object itself, but the echo it leaves behind. Long after the food is eaten, the tool worn away, the gesture forgotten by time, a faint warmth remains, a pulse of connection that hums beneath the surface of the mind. In the earliest societies, this invisible residue of exchange became the architecture of belonging. To remember who had given what, and when, was to participate in the living fabric of the group. To forget was to unravel it. The past, in such a world, was not a series of dates or events, but a vast, breathing network of remembered gifts. Every person was a node within it, their worth measured not by possessions but by their reliability within that web of memory. This is why the act of giving was never purely generous. It was always double-edged, always laced with the awareness that what one gave would return, transformed. In many early communities, the most honored individuals were not those who accumulated wealth, but those who dispersed it, those who gave so much that they became radiant with obligation, surrounded by invisible strings that tethered others to them. Their wealth was measured in promises, not possessions. And yet, such power was precarious. To fail to give when expected, to withhold when one had abundance, could invert esteem into suspicion. A gift delayed could become an accusation. The first economies, if we can even call them that, were governed not by currency but by rhythm, the rhythm of the seasons, of growth and decay, of giving and return. In times of abundance, generosity was expected; in times of scarcity, patience was demanded. The system worked only as long as the community's collective memory remained intact. But memory, as fragile as it is sacred, falters under strain. As populations grew, as villages expanded into networks of trade stretching beyond kinship, the web of obligations became too vast for any one mind to hold. The invisible bonds began to fray, and something unprecedented began to emerge: the need for record, for form, for symbols that could stand in for trust. Before writing, there were tokens, small, shaped bits of clay found throughout the Near East, dating back to 8000 BCE. Each token represented something tangible: a measure of grain, a goat, a jar of oil. They were sealed within clay envelopes called bulli, which served as promises, contracts made visible. When one gave grain to another, tokens marked the transaction; when the debt was repaid, the tokens were removed. These humble pieces of clay were the first prosthetic memories, the first attempts to externalize the fragile human capacity for remembering who owed what. In a sense, they were the first ancestors of money, but their spirit was different. They were not tools of commerce, but of trust. Each bore the weight of faith that promises could endure even when the giver was far away. Yet with every attempt to record trust, something was lost. The clay remembered without emotion; it did not blush, it did not feel shame, it did not know gratitude. What had once been warm and human became cold and abstract. Still, abstraction was power. For the first time, value could travel beyond the body, beyond personal relationship. The seed of currency, and with it, the seed of civilization, had been planted. But in the deep twilight before coins, this process was slow, hesitant, almost reluctant. People still preferred the moral certainty of personal exchange. A tool given by hand, face to face, carried more meaning than any mark upon clay. The living gaze of the giver was the true guarantee. Even so, cracks had begun to appear in the moral architecture of the gift. As societies grew more complex, not all exchanges were equal. There were those who gave because they must, and those who could afford to give because others labored beneath them. In this way, the once fluid dance of reciprocity began to solidify into hierarchy. Chiefs distributed food to their people, but the food had been gathered by many hands. The chief's generosity masked the extraction beneath it. And yet, this illusion of giving as power became one of the most enduring myths of civilization, that the powerful give because they are generous, and the weak receive because they are needy. In truth, both were bound in a circle neither could escape, the giver trapped by the need to maintain authority through gifts, the receiver bound by the obligation to repay what could never truly be repaid. To the ancient mind, this web of exchange extended far beyond human society. The gods themselves were seen as participants in the cosmic barter. Rain fell upon the fields, and in return, offerings were made, grain, incense, blood, song. The relationship between mortals and the divine was governed by the same logic as that between neighbors. To receive a blessing without offering gratitude was to risk imbalance, and imbalance invited catastrophe. In this way, religion became the spiritual continuation of barter, a sacred economy of exchange between seen and unseen worlds. Every sacrifice was a kind of payment, every prayer a promissory note to the heavens. The temple, in its earliest form, was less a place of worship than a storehouse, a physical manifestation of the exchange between people and gods. Offerings were gathered there, redistributed by priests, and tallied with care. Over time, the temple's role expanded, it became a keeper of accounts, a stabilizer of trust, an arbiter of fairness. It remembered on behalf of the community. In ancient Sumer, tablets from as early as 3000 BCE record lists of grain owed, labor performed, livestock traded, the faint clay shadows of the first economies of obligation. What had begun as memory had become administration. And though it gave structure, it also gave rise to a new anxiety, that value could now exist without the presence of a person. This transformation, from relational to representational value, was subtle, but irreversible. The gift that once carried the warmth of a hand now lived as a symbol, detached from human touch. And yet, beneath this growing abstraction, the old moral heartbeat still pulsed. The earliest records do not speak of markets or profits, but of fairness, of balance, of reciprocity. The people of the ancient Near East still understood trade as a moral act, even as they learned to encode it in clay. To cheat was to sin, to hoard was to anger the gods. The new systems of record did not erase the old laws of the gift, they merely extended them into a larger, more impersonal world. But not all cultures chose this path. In more isolated societies, where trust could still be measured by memory, the old rhythm endured. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, in the forests of the Amazon, even into modern times, people continued to trade through intricate systems of gifting that had little to do with material value. A carved shell might circulate for years, passing from one family to another, each transfer a reaffirmation of kinship and respect. No one owned it in the modern sense, it belonged to the chain of relationships itself. The object was merely the vessel, the true cargo was memory. If there is something eerie in this, and there is, it is because it reminds us that our modern systems of value are built upon something ancient, invisible, and unresolved. Every coin, every banknote, every digital transaction still carries within it the ghost of that first gift, that first moment of trust. Money has become abstraction, but beneath it lies the same moral pulse, a quiet, almost unconscious expectation of fairness, of return, of balance restored. To owe remains to be human, to give remains to be powerful. And yet, we no longer see it. We have forgotten the sacred weight that once accompanied every exchange. In the world before coins, the boundary between the material and the spiritual was porous. To trade was to touch both. A fisherman offering his catch for a pot did not merely exchange sustenance for craft, he affirmed that the universe was coherent, that effort could be transformed into need, that everything given returned in some form. It was a small act of faith in the stability of existence itself. Perhaps that is why the earliest stories of the gods are filled with themes of trade and gift, Prometheus giving fire, Inanna descending to the underworld with her adornments as offerings, the reciprocity of sacrifice that sustains the world. These myths remember what barter once was, a sacred equilibrium between forces. And so, the first exchanges were not only practical but metaphysical. They carried within them the seed of ethics, religion, and art. The desire to give well, to give beautifully, to give meaningfully, this too is an inheritance of barter. The pot decorated before being traded, the food arranged before being shared, the ritual words spoken as gifts change hands, these are the gestures through which trade became culture. What began as necessity evolved into expression. As we stand at the threshold of the next age, the age of tokens, weights, and finally, coins, we must linger here, in this twilight between memory and abstraction. For here, in the shadow of firelight, humanity first learned to see value not as a thing, but as a relationship. Every early trade was an act of storytelling, a promise that meaning could travel between souls. In that sense, barter was not replaced by money, it was merely buried beneath it. The logic of the gift still lives within us, flickering beneath the arithmetic of commerce. To understand it is to understand ourselves, the deep, ancient yearning to connect, to balance, to be remembered through what we give and receive. Before coins, there were only gifts, and the long, echoing silence of obligation that followed them, a silence that shaped the human world. There is a moment in human history, faint, almost imperceptible, when the quiet current of giving and returning began to twist into something else. Where once the gift had bound people together in a circle of reciprocity, now it began to form chains. What was once a rhythm became a rule. And what had once been remembered with gratitude began to be recorded with fear. Debt, that strange and invisible shadow of the gift, was born not from greed, but from trust stretched too thin, from promises that had grown too large for memory to hold. Imagine a village on the banks of the Euphrates around 5,000 years ago. The harvest has been poor. One family borrows grain from another, promising to repay after the next harvest. The agreement is sealed not with written words, but with witnesses and ritual, perhaps a touch of the hand, perhaps the gods invoked. Yet when the next harvest comes, drought lingers, the fields are thin, and repayment is impossible. The lender, once generous, now becomes insistent. His own family must eat. The borrower feels the heat of shame, the old weight of obligation curdling into guilt. The promise remains unfulfilled, suspended in time like a wound that will not close. This, perhaps, was the first debt, not the first exchange, but the first unmet one. It is here that something subtle shifts in the human heart. The cycle of reciprocity, once open and flowing, begins to ossify. Obligation, which once sustained the moral balance of the group, becomes a measure of domination. The one who gives is no longer a friend, but a creditor. The one who receives is no longer kin, but debtor. It is a change so profound that it would echo for millennia, shaping empires, laws, and the very idea of justice. At its core, debt is memory weaponized. In the world before writing, memory was sacred, fragile, and human. To remember who owed what was to remember who belonged to whom. But when writing emerged, those marks upon clay and stone that could endure beyond the span of human life, memory escaped the body. It became immortal, unyielding. The ledger replaced the heart. Now the debt could outlive both the giver and the receiver. What had once been a relationship became a structure. The invisible web of reciprocity hardened into a hierarchy of account. We find traces of this transformation in the earliest written records from Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE. Tablets inscribed in cuneiform record lists of goods, measures of barley, silver, oil, livestock, loaned and to be repaid. The language of obligation had begun to take form, etched in the hard permanence of clay. In the temples of Uruk and Lagash, scribes became the new priests of memory, their styluses the instruments of power. To owe was no longer a matter of shame before the community, it was a legal fact, a number in the hands of the temple. The debt was no longer a moral imbalance to be righted, but a resource to be managed. And yet, the concept of debt was still cloaked in sacred language. The Sumerians called their debts hubolu, a term that resonated with both moral and divine undertones. To be indebted was to be bound by the gods themselves. The temple, which had once mediated between humans and the divine through offerings, now mediated between humans themselves through loans. Grain stored for the gods could be lent to the people, and when repaid with interest, the gods' store grew, a cycle that sanctified profit and power in equal measure. In this way, the birth of debt was not an economic event, but a theological one. The gods, once the guarantors of balance, had become creditors. And where the gods led, kings followed. In time, rulers began to recognize the double-edged nature of debt. On one hand, it bound their people to the temples and to one another, stabilizing society through obligation. On the other, it threatened to strangle the very foundations of that society when left unchecked. Too much debt led to unrest, to servitude, to the loss of freedom. And so, periodically, the ancient kings of Mesopotamia would issue a debt jubilee, a general amnesty that erased debts, freed the enslaved, and restored balance. These decrees, inscribed upon stone, were less acts of mercy than acts of survival. They reminded the people that though obligation was powerful, it was not eternal. That beneath the weight of debt, the moral order of the cosmos still demanded renewal. But human nature is not so easily pacified. As trade expanded beyond the temple and the village, as caravans began to traverse the deserts and the seas, the web of obligations grew more tangled. Strangers met in markets who shared no kinship, no gods, no shared memory of trust. How could one promise to repay a stranger? How could one trust that a favor would return? In this uncertainty, debt became not just memory weaponized, but trust abstracted. It became a tool to bridge distance, a promise backed not by relationship, but by authority. The state, the temple, the merchant class, all arose as guarantors of trust, mediating between individuals through systems of record and coercion. In this new order, obligation was measured not in gratitude but in time. A loan demanded repayment at a future date, a subtle, almost metaphysical shift in the human sense of temporality. The future itself became collateral. To borrow was to trade one's tomorrow for survival today. To lend was to own a portion of another's future. Debt thus became not only economic, but existential, a claim upon the yet unlived life of another. The moral weight of this transformation is immense, and even now, in our modern world, we still carry its shadow. The ancient world understood this unease. Myths and religious texts echo with anxiety about debt. In the Sumerian epic of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, trade between distant lands is framed as a contest of obligation: who will give, who will repay, who will bow. In the Hebrew Bible, debt becomes a moral warning: the borrower is slave to the lender. The very word, sin, in several ancient languages shares roots with words for debt and obligation. To be indebted was not merely to owe, it was to be spiritually unclean, morally incomplete, cosmically unbalanced. Redemption and repayment were, in essence, the same act. And yet, within this system of control, there remained a haunting paradox: debt could both enslave and connect. It could destroy trust, but also create it. For without the promise of repayment, trade itself would falter. Debt became the nervous system of civilization, pulsing with promises, binding the living together in invisible threads of expectation and fear. From the simplest village loan to the sprawling empires of Babylon and Assyria, debt linked the smallest farmer to the highest priest, the poorest widow to the wealth of the gods. The earliest forms of interest reveal the moral complexity of this arrangement. In many Mesopotamian records, interest was not seen as exploitation, but as the natural reproduction of life. Grain loans carried an interest rate that mirrored the expected yield of the next harvest, around 20%, the same ratio by which nature was thought to renew itself. To lend grain and receive more in return was simply to imitate the fertility of the earth. It was only later, when silver replaced grain as the unit of account, that interest became detached from the rhythms of nature and began to devour itself, a sterile, metallic multiplication that had no end. It is here that we see the birth of abstraction taking its most dangerous form. When value ceased to be organic, when it could grow not through life, but through number, debt became endless. What had once been a tool for balance now became an engine of control. And behind this shift, unseen yet omnipresent, was the slow, steady rise of written calculation. Every mark on clay was a claim, every tablet a chain. The scribes who recorded these marks were the keepers of civilization's most potent magic, the ability to turn promise into permanence. To owe, in such a world, was to be named. One's debt was one's identity, etched into clay as indelibly as one's lineage. The poorest laborer could not escape his obligations, they followed him beyond death, inherited by his children like a curse. Yet even this system required its counterbalance, and so, the idea of mercy arose, not as sentiment, but as necessity. The rulers who issued debt forgiveness did not act from compassion alone, they acted from fear of collapse. For too much imbalance, too much accumulation of unpaid promises, threatened to tear society apart. Debt, though invisible, was weighty enough to topple kings. Thus, from its earliest days, the history of debt was also the history of power. It defined who could command, who must obey, who was free to lend and who was doomed to borrow. And yet, even as it hardened into law, debt never fully shed its moral and spiritual skin. Beneath the ledgers and contracts, the old language of the gift still murmured, faint but persistent, a reminder that all obligation, no matter how formalized, was born of the ancient desire to belong, to balance, to be seen by another. Debt, then, was not merely an economic invention, it was a psychological revelation. It exposed something unsettling within the human condition, that the same impulse that drives us to share also drives us to control. That the bond which unites us can, if stretched too far, become a shackle. In that tension lies the entire story of civilization, our yearning to give, our fear of loss, our invention of systems to keep both desires in check. In the dim temples of Mesopotamia, as scribes etched numbers into clay by torchlight, they could not have known that they were shaping the destiny of all future economies, that every credit and every debt, every ledger and every law, would trace its lineage back to these marks. They could not have known that their careful records of barley and silver would one day evolve into the global web of credit that governs the modern world. And yet, the essence is unchanged. Debt remains what it always was, the shadow of trust, the echo of the gift, the memory that refuses to fade. When debt first began to take hold of the human soul, it was not yet the cold arithmetic of finance, but a trembling presence, an invisible hand resting upon the conscience. The debtor felt its weight in the stomach, in the throat, in the restless turning of the mind at night. It was a presence that spoke without words, whispering, "You owe." And with that whisper came hierarchy, obedience, and the first faint outlines of class. For the man who lent was elevated above the man who borrowed, not by divine decree, but by the delicate machinery of obligation itself. The one who could afford to wait, who could give now and receive later, became master of time. And mastery of time, of tomorrow's promises and yesterday's memory, was the first form of power that no blade could challenge. Across the ancient cities of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, this invisible hierarchy thickened like sediment. Tablets accumulated, covered with lists of debts and payments, tokens of trust turned to stone. Entire rooms of clay archives were filled with these fragile promises, stacked neatly in temple vaults or royal storehouses. Each mark of cuneiform represented a thread in the great tapestry of obligation, some fulfilled, many not. What had once been the heartbeat of gift and return was now an immense and intricate web of dependency. And within this web, a few began to see the true potential of debt not as burden, but as control. The merchant class emerged here, those who trafficked not in goods themselves, but in the expectation of goods. They advanced grain before the harvest, lent silver before the trade, supplied armies before victory. In every case, what they purchased was not labor or commodity, but future certainty. They learned to feed on risk, to profit from patience. For them, debt was no longer an accident of scarcity, it was a design. And once designed, it spread like a quiet contagion through the body of civilization. The temples, those old centers of moral exchange, became the earliest banks. They stored not only grain and oil but trust itself. They guaranteed repayment, recorded agreements, mediated disputes. The gods' houses became institutions of credit. Their divine authority gave legitimacy to the promises etched in clay. A transaction made before the gods I was binding, eternal. And yet, beneath the sanctity of the temple lay a colder truth, debt was power's new mask, cloaked in piety. The priest who recorded your debt was not merely a servant of the divine, he was the guardian of your freedom. In the slow current of centuries, debt began to shape not only individuals but empires. When city-states waged war, they borrowed to feed their soldiers, to fortify their walls, to secure the loyalty of mercenaries. Victory, if it came, was followed by conquest, and conquest by tribute. Debt extended from person to city, from city to empire. Kings lent grain to villages and demanded repayment in labor or land. A farmer unable to repay lost not only his property but often his personhood. His children might be taken as servants, his wife as bondswoman, his future swallowed by obligation. Debt had grown fangs. It no longer needed compassion to sustain itself. It had become a system. And yet, even systems must be justified. Ancient rulers learned to speak of debt in the language of order. It was said that debt preserved harmony, that those who borrowed did so because the gods had willed it, and those who lent did so in their stead. The moral landscape inverted itself. To owe became shameful, while to collect became righteous. The creditor was no longer the giver, but the enforcer of divine balance. The debtor, by failing to repay, was seen as a violator of cosmic law. In the ancient codes, Hammurabi's among them, we see the crystallization of this idea. Debt was no longer a private matter but a pillar of justice itself. The state claimed the role of arbiter, ensuring that promises, once made, could not dissolve into mercy. And yet, Hammurabi's code also betrays an anxiety beneath its stern declarations. It limits interest rates, forbids the enslavement of certain classes, and prescribes forgiveness under specific conditions. Even as debt was sanctified, it remained dangerous, a god that might turn on its worshippers. For every system of credit contains its own apocalypse. If too many owe too much for too long, the structure buckles under its own weight. The kings knew this, the scribes recorded it. Periodic debt cancellations, known as amarghi, return to mother, were proclaimed to restore social equilibrium. The phrase itself is haunting. To forgive debt was to return people to the womb of society, to undo the chains that bound them to others' wealth. Freedom, in its earliest recorded form, was not political. It was economic. To be free was to be without debt. Still, these jubilees were temporary reprieves. The system always reassembled itself, as if drawn by gravity. The logic of debt was too seductive, too efficient, too useful for those in power. It organized society without visible chains. It turned loyalty into numbers, obligation into productivity. It could motivate labor more effectively than fear, for debt makes the debtor his own overseer. He toils not under the whip, but under the whisper of his own conscience. The cruelty of debt is that it masquerades as fairness. Every burden feels self-imposed. As centuries passed, the material form of debt evolved. Silver replaced barley as the unit of account. The sacred weight of the temple's stores became the measure of all things. With metal, debt became portable. A coin could represent a promise, a future, a life. Metal was impartial, it remembered without mercy. And yet, even this innovation was born of crisis, the need to simplify the unmanageable complexity of obligations as empires grew vast and impersonal. Money, in this sense, did not destroy debt. It was its offspring, its visible incarnation. In Egypt, in Babylon, in early China, and in the valleys of the Indus, the logic was the same. Debt was the thread that bound households to the state, peasants to landlords, men to gods. The pharaoh's tax collectors measured not only grain but the souls of their subjects. To owe the king was to exist within his order, to default was to fall into chaos. And so, record-keeping, the dry art of counting, became the skeleton of civilization. Every mark upon papyrus, every tally upon a bone or tablet, was a testament to the belief that order could be inscribed upon the world. But what is most haunting in this story is not the cruelty of debt, but its intimacy. Unlike conquest or law, it does not arrive from outside. It begins within, as trust, as promise, as generosity. It grows quietly, invisibly, until it becomes indistinguishable from duty. Even now, the language of debt still carries traces of its moral ancestry. We speak of owing gratitude, of repaying kindness, of forgiving, rather than canceling what is due. These phrases are fossils of the old world, when economy and emotion were one. We have forgotten their origins, but they persist in our speech like the bones of long-dead gods buried beneath our cities. In this way, the birth of debt was also the birth of abstraction, not only in the material sense but in the moral one. When value could be separated from substance, when obligation could be written rather than remembered, when time itself could be divided into payments and terms, humanity crossed an invisible threshold. We entered a realm where promises could outlive the promisers, where relationships could be reduced to numbers, where empathy could be replaced by law. Civilization was born in that exchange, but so too was alienation. Yet even within the cold geometry of debt, the old yearning for balance endures. The ancients understood what we often forget, that debt cannot be infinite, because the human soul is not. Every ledger must one day be erased, every imbalance righted, every weight lifted. That is why the great religions of the world, though they arose in different lands, all inherited a similar vocabulary. In Sumer and Babylon, debt was both moral and material. In the Hebrew world, the word for debt, av, became entwined with sin. In early Christianity, the Lord's Prayer spoke of forgiving debts as one forgives trespasses, an echo of those ancient jubilees when the burdened were released. In India, the concept of a held that every person is born indebted, to gods, to ancestors, to teachers, to all living beings, and that life itself is the act of repayment. Debt became the bridge between the material and the metaphysical, between economics and ethics. It defined not only how we traded, but how we understood justice, salvation, and guilt. To be human was to owe, to the land, to time, to the divine. And yet, hidden within this universal truth was a subtle shift of power. The ability to define who owed what became the privilege of rulers and priests. To control debt was to control morality itself. In this sense, the earliest empires were not only political entities but moral economies, where every act of lending and borrowing carried the weight of cosmic consequence. As the Bronze Age deepened, debt reached its full maturity. Great kingdoms rose and fell upon its tides. Armies marched for payment, and cities crumbled under the weight of arrears. When Babylon fell to the Persians, the conquerors found not just walls and temples, but archives, millions of tablets inscribed with obligations. The empire's true treasure was not gold or grain, but record. For record was power. And yet, behind these archives lay an older silence, the silence of the first gift, the first exchange, the first promise made without expectation. That silence had not vanished, it lingered beneath the surface of civilization like an old song forgotten but not erased. It would whisper again in later ages, when prophets cried out for mercy, when philosophers spoke of justice, when revolutionaries dreamed of freedom. They would all, knowingly or not, be answering the same ancient question: when did our promises begin to enslave us? In the dim glow of a temple lamp, a scribe once pressed his stylus into wet clay, marking the repayment of a long-forgotten loan. The clay hardened, the names endured, the debt recorded. Thousands of years later, that tablet lies silent in a museum, its marks still legible, its numbers intact. But the people are gone, their obligations dissolved into dust. The clay remembers what the heart no longer can. Perhaps that is the truest image of debt, a memory that outlives its meaning, a promise that endures after both giver and receiver have turned to earth. It began, as most transformations in the long story of humanity do, not with an invention, but with a quiet shift in perception. Before there were coins, before the stamped discs that glittered under the Anatolian sun, there were pieces of metal weighed by hand, tested by bite, melted and remelted until the notion of worth began to cling to them like a scent that would not wash away. In that dawning age, humanity had already learned the grammar of exchange, they had already spoken the language of obligation, of debt, of favor returned and promise unfulfilled. But metal brought a new element into the equation: permanence. Where grain could rot and cattle could die, where shells could crack and textiles could fade, metal endured. It shone with a stubbornness that seemed almost supernatural. It could be melted, reforged, hidden in the earth, and unearthed centuries later, still whispering of the hands that once held it. It was not simply a thing, it was a vessel for human belief. The earliest glimmerings of metallic trade were crude, yet astonishing in their subtlety. In Mesopotamia, where temple economies measured barley and silver side by side, bits of precious metal began to circulate as a kind of abstract measure, an agreement between buyer and seller that this much silver equals that much grain. Yet silver itself was rarely used in standardized pieces. It was weighed, its purity guessed at or tested through ancient methods involving biting, burning, or rubbing it against touchstones of dark stone. Even then, value was not in the metal itself but in the trust that surrounded it, the invisible field of expectation that stretched between two people across a transaction. But slowly, as these exchanges multiplied, something began to solidify. The measuring of metal became less an act of trust and more an act of ritual precision. The scale replaced memory, and weight began to carry moral as well as practical gravity. To cheat a scale was not simply a crime, it was sacrilege, an affront to the balance that held the cosmos in order. It is in this sense that metal, for the ancients, was never inert. Bronze was an alloy, born of fire and human will, a marriage of elements that mirrored the merging of social forces. Gold was incorruptible, a perfect mirror of the divine. Silver was lunar, its pale shimmer echoing the cyclical flows of debt and payment. Each had a symbolic logic that would later shape the metaphors of money itself. To hold gold was to hold something of the sun, to hoard silver was to capture the moon's reflection. To mint a coin, when that act finally came, was to participate in an alchemy that merged power, faith, and material into one enduring sign. But before the first coin was struck, there were long centuries of preparation, a gestation of both matter and mind. In Lydia, that fertile crossroads of Asia Minor, where merchants and kings and travelers converged, electrum was found in the rivers, an alloy of gold and silver born not from artifice, but from nature's own mixing. The people of Lydia, observant and practical, gathered these gleaming nuggets and began to trade them by weight. Yet even then, human nature sought symbols. Marks began to appear, first crude impressions to signify ownership, then deliberate stamps denoting the authority of a city or a ruler. What had begun as a convenience of trade transformed into an assertion of power. The stamped mark declared, "This metal's value is guaranteed not by your trust in me, but by the word of the king." It was the moment the divine and the political fused with the economic. To call this the birth of money is too simplistic. It was, more precisely, the birth of measured belief. The coin was not a tool of trade, it was a crystallized act of faith. It made visible the invisible currents that had always pulsed beneath exchange: trust, authority, memory, fear. Each stamped piece of electrum was a compact between the individual and the collective, between the fleeting needs of daily life and the eternal hunger for certainty. When a merchant accepted a coin, he accepted not only its metal but the invisible signature of the ruler's word and the shared dream of stability that held his world together. Archaeologists have unearthed such coins, small, irregular lumps of metal bearing the faint impressions of lions, bulls, or human faces. To the modern eye they seem primitive, but to the Lydian merchant they were almost sacred. Imagine the feel of it in the palm, the cool, dense weight, the faint scent of metal and earth, the mark of the king's seal pressed deep enough to survive centuries. Imagine, too, the quiet anxiety beneath that transaction, the awareness that the coin's power came not from its beauty, but from its belief, and that belief could falter. To live by coin was to live by faith in a fragile order of equivalence. From Lydia, the idea spread like light refracted through metal. Greek city-states began to mint their own coins, each marked with symbols of civic pride and mythic protection. Athens struck silver owls, wise, serene, guardians of commerce and knowledge. Corinth minted the winged Pegasus, swift and uncatchable. In each, art met arithmetic, divine imagery fused with economic necessity. These coins were not merely practical, they were miniature proclamations of identity. Each polis spoke through its coinage, announcing to traders and travelers, "This is who we are. This is what we promise." The coin became a kind of passport, a piece of the city itself carried across the Aegean and beyond. But the Greeks, ever aware of paradox, also sensed the danger in this new abstraction. Philosophers like Aristotle would later argue that money was a tool, a measure that existed by convention, not by nature. Yet beneath such reasoning, there pulsed a quiet unease, that to reduce the richness of human need and desire to a number was to sever something sacred. Still, the convenience was irresistible. Coins made possible a new fluidity, a loosening of the old bonds of barter and debt. They allowed strangers to meet in markets and transact without memory. They freed exchange from the web of personal obligation, and in doing so, they also made it colder, more anonymous. What had once been a human promise became a metallic one. Across the Mediterranean, the Romans would later refine and weaponize this system. They understood instinctively that to control coinage was to control reality. The emperor's face stamped upon a denarius was not merely decoration, it was a declaration of divine legitimacy. To spend Roman coins was to participate in the empire's narrative, to accept the fiction that Rome's authority extended as far as its currency flowed. When an emperor's rule faltered, his coins often told the tale first. A sudden debasement, less silver, more copper, was not only an act of economic desperation but a silent confession of political decay. Money, in its gleam, reflected the soul of the state. And so, as metal became measure, the world changed. The market replaced the temple as the locus of trust. Value became portable, divisible, and impersonally guaranteed. But the old ghosts of barter never vanished, they lingered beneath the clink of coins, whispering of favors once owed, of gifts once given freely, of a time when value had a face and a name. The coin, in its perfect roundness, sought to erase that memory, to smooth the irregular edges of human relationship. Yet every transaction carried within it the echo of that ancient question, what is worth? And who decides it? Even now, when we handle coins worn smooth by countless hands, we can feel the residue of those early transformations. The coin is both object and story, both weight and word. It is the material shadow of belief. It reminds us that before money there was meaning, and before the measure there was mystery. For though metal endures, the true value it carries remains as invisible, and as elusive, as trust itself. The transition from raw metal to minted coin was not simply technological, it was spiritual. To the ancients, to smelt, melt, and stamp metal was to practice a quiet alchemy, a transformation that mirrored the divine work of creation itself. Within the heat of the furnace, the boundary between matter and meaning blurred. In that roaring crucible, gold became more than gold, silver more than silver, it became promise, measure, order. The blacksmith's forge was a kind of temple, the die and hammer were its sacraments. When the first coins emerged from the flames, bright and circular and stamped with the mark of power, they did not merely represent value, they generated it. It was as though a piece of the sun had been pressed into permanence, a portable shard of the divine. In ancient Anatolia, these first mints were often housed within temple precincts, under the watchful eyes of priestly officials. This was no coincidence. The temple was both bank and mint, a sacred vault where wealth and worship intertwined. The stamping of metal with divine symbols ensured not just economic trust but cosmic legitimacy. A lion's head, a sunburst, a bull, each image spoke to the sacred myths that girded the world's fragile sense of balance. To question the coin's worth was to question the gods themselves. Thus, from the very beginning, money carried the scent of sanctity. The clink of coin was the echo of ritual. The act of payment, a shadow of sacrifice. And yet, for all its divine associations, coinage also introduced a subtle alienation into human life. Where once exchange had been a matter of memory and face, it now became a matter of metal and mark. The coin freed the individual from personal obligation but bound him instead to the abstraction of value itself. Markets began to hum with an energy that was both thrilling and disquieting, transactions occurring between strangers, each trusting not in the other, but in the thing that passed between them. The coin was a silent witness, an intermediary that carried meaning without emotion. It made possible vast webs of exchange, yet in doing so, it also began to erode the intimacy that had defined human trade since its beginning. Across the Aegean, Greek artisans perfected this art of minting into a kind of sculptural poetry. Their coins bore not merely symbols but exquisite miniature portraits, gods rendered with tender precision, mythic beasts caught in motion. Each coin was a tiny world, an emblem of civic pride, a distillation of aesthetic and moral ideals. The Athenian owl, solemn and unblinking, came to represent not only Athens itself but the clarity of thought, the wisdom of trade. The Corinthian Pegasus, captured mid-flight, spoke of aspiration and freedom. The coins circulated far beyond their cities of origin, spreading both wealth and identity. Wherever an Athenian drachma landed, the spirit of Athens followed. Money became a form of language, a dialect of empire, subtle yet persuasive. But beneath the beauty, a shadow grew. For as soon as value became something that could be measured, hoarded, and multiplied, greed found its altar. The old moral codes that had governed gift and barter began to tremble. The gift had always implied reciprocity, a cycle of giving and receiving that bound communities together. Coinage, in its impersonal perfection, broke that circle. A transaction ended once the coins changed hands. No memory lingered, no bond remained. The ancients sensed this loss and tried, in their myths and philosophies, to reconcile it. The story of King Midas, whose touch turned all to gold, was not a tale of wonder but of warning. The very substance that symbolized divine wealth became a curse, rendering food inedible, life ungraspable. Gold was abundance turned sterile, a mirror reflecting desire until it devoured itself. In Rome, this moral paradox became political. The empire minted coins not merely as tools of trade but as instruments of propaganda. Each new emperor issued his likeness to assert legitimacy, to imprint his face upon the consciousness of every citizen. To spend was to acknowledge authority, to save was to store loyalty. Coins crossed continents, carrying imperial imagery from the marble forums of Rome to the windswept edges of Britannia and the deserts of Africa. They were the empire's emissaries, more enduring than its legions. Even when cities fell and emperors perished, their coins survived, mute testaments to ambitions long extinguished. Roman coins were a marvel of symbolism. On one side, the portrait of the ruler, serene, godlike, immutable. On the other, scenes of conquest, virtue, divine favor. Fides, pax, virtus, faith, peace, valor, stamped into metal, repeated endlessly across the empire's vast expanse. But with time, the purity of these coins began to wane. Silver was cut with baser metals, gold diluted, until the image of trust itself corroded. The populace could feel it in their hands, the weight slightly lighter, the shine slightly duller. Confidence faltered. And so it was that money, once born from faith, could also erode it. The alchemy that gave metal meaning could just as easily reverse itself, returning gold to dust, trust to suspicion. In distant lands, other civilizations followed their own paths to metallic measure. In China, where bronze had long been revered, the first coins took the shape of knives and spades, echoes of agricultural tools, linking currency to the labor of the land. Later, round coins with square holes emerged, symbolizing heaven and earth, circulation and stability. These were threaded together in strings, the sound of their soft chime accompanying daily life. To the Chinese mind, coinage was not merely economic but cosmic, a reflection of the universe's harmony. To cast coins was to align human order with celestial order. The emperor, as the Son of Heaven, alone held the right to mint, his authority as absolute as the rhythm of the stars. Thus, in East and West alike, the act of minting was an act of creation, the forging of symbolic universes in metal. But if coinage bound societies together, it also created new divisions. Wealth became measurable, and therefore, comparable. Inequality acquired a precision it had never possessed before. The poor no longer owed merely labor or loyalty, they owed money, a unit of obligation stripped of mercy. Debt, once personal, became systemic. And those who controlled the mint controlled the rhythm of life itself. The forge, once sacred, became a factory of power. To command the coin was to dictate what was valuable, and by extension, who was. There were voices who resisted this growing abstraction. In ancient philosophy, from the Stoics to the Cynics, one hears faint protests against the tyranny of money, the belief that virtue, not metal, should govern exchange. Diogenes, the mad philosopher of the barrel, mocked the marketplace, declaring that true freedom could only exist outside the walls of commerce. Yet even he could not escape its influence, for the coin had already reshaped thought itself. It taught humans to think in terms of equivalence, to measure worth, to weigh every action against its imagined return. It introduced a logic that would one day permeate law, morality, and even love. The coin, then, was never merely economic. It was metaphysical. It trained the human mind to see the world in ratios, to translate the intangible into the measurable. It invited humanity to step further into abstraction, to believe not only in gods unseen, but in value unseen. In that sense, coinage was the rehearsal for the modern imagination, a discipline of faith in symbols. And perhaps this is why the sound of coins, even now, carries something hypnotic. The faint ringing of metal against metal is an echo of the earliest mysteries of measure, a ritual sound from the forge of civilization itself. In the end, the coin taught us how to dream in numbers, how to see eternity in weight and worth. It allowed empires to rise and religions to spread, armies to march and ideas to travel. But it also planted a deeper question in the heart of humanity, one that still haunts the edges of every transaction. When value is made visible, what is lost in the unseen? For within every coin lies the ghost of its origins, a whisper of barter and gift, of obligation and trust. And as we trace its gleaming surface, we are reminded that this perfect circle, this symbol of balance, was born from the fire of desire and the ashes of faith. Long before there were ledgers, banks, or the silent arithmetic of interest, there existed a marketplace unseen, woven not of stalls or streets, but of minds and mutual faith. It was a marketplace made of ritual and memory, one that thrived not in the visible exchange of goods but in the invisible exchange of trust. For value, as it would slowly come to be understood, did not reside in objects at all, but in the quiet belief that something meant something to someone else. The invisible market was not a place, but a condition, a spiritual climate, an unspoken understanding that every act of trade, every offering and repayment, was part of a cosmic rhythm that bound human life to the unseen. When the first coins were struck and the first debts recorded on clay tablets, the invisible market did not vanish, it merely retreated deeper into the folds of human thought. Every economy has its ghosts, and the earliest were those of faith, favor, and fear. When a farmer traded grain for silver, he did not merely exchange substance for substance. He traded a fragment of his own time, his sweat crystallized in the form of labor, for a promise that the silver could, in some future, redeem that labor in another form. That promise existed nowhere but in the shared imagination. The silver, the scales, the words, these were symbols. The true transaction took place in the mind, in the delicate bridge of trust that leapt from one heart to another. In the temples of Mesopotamia, the priests understood this truth. They recorded debts not simply to count, but to maintain cosmic balance. Each loan, each payment, each offering was part of a sacred ledger that extended beyond the human world. The gods, it was believed, took note of the honesty of exchange. Fairness was not merely a civic virtue but a spiritual necessity, a way to keep chaos, the unmeasured, the unbounded, at bay. The invisible market thus began as a reflection of divine order. In each transaction, humans mimicked the harmony they perceived in the heavens. Every act of giving or repayment was a prayer disguised as commerce, an echo of the belief that the universe itself was a system of balances, light and darkness, debt and forgiveness, offering and return. Over time, as societies grew and their economies became more complex, this invisible dimension did not fade, it deepened. The invention of money made value portable, but it also made it abstract. No longer tied to the tangible world of livestock and grain, value began to drift toward the unseen, toward faith in systems, in reputations, in symbols. Merchants carried this invisible market within them as they crossed deserts and oceans. They traded not merely goods, but belief that a promise made in one place would be honored in another, belief that the name of a man or a city carried weight beyond distance. Trust became the most precious currency, more enduring than silver, more elusive than gold. In the ancient Mediterranean, this trust often took the form of ritual. Deals were sealed with oaths, libations poured to the gods of commerce. The invisible market required witnesses not of flesh, but of spirit. Hermes in Greece, Mercury in Rome, Thoth in Egypt, all were deities of both trade and trickery, guardians of thresholds where truth and deceit intertwined. For every honest bargain depended on the possibility of betrayal. To trade was to risk, and to risk was to invoke the unseen. In that sense, every transaction was a small act of faith, and every failure of trust a kind of spiritual injury. The Greeks even had a word for it: pistis, faith, confidence, credit. To give credit was to believe, to extend trust into the future. And when that trust was broken, it was not just an economic loss but a wound to the moral fabric of the world. In India, the same invisible logic expressed itself through the concept of dharma, right order, cosmic law. Here, too, the marketplace was sacred, the balance of give and take an echo of universal harmony. The bania, the merchant, was not merely a trader of goods but a custodian of equilibrium. Wealth, if gained unjustly, would disrupt the moral order. Debt, if left unpaid, could reverberate through lifetimes. Karma itself became the ultimate ledger, a spiritual account that transcended lifetimes, where every deed, good or ill, would one day be reconciled. Thus, the invisible market extended beyond economics into metaphysics. The soul itself was a kind of currency, its worth determined by the balance of actions across time. In China, Confucian thought wove the invisible market into the fabric of social order. Every exchange, from the emperor's decree to the peasant's bargain, carried with it a moral resonance. Ritual propriety governed not only worship but trade. A fair deal was not simply efficient, it was righteous, an affirmation of one's place in the hierarchy of heaven and earth. Here again, trust was everything. The merchant's reputation, his xin, meaning both trust and truth, was his invisible coinage. A man without trust was bankrupt, regardless of his silver. This idea would outlive dynasties, shaping markets and moral codes long after the empires that birthed them turned to dust. The invisible market, then, was not an invention but an inheritance, one carried quietly through centuries of barter, coin, and commerce. It resided in the spaces between, in the unspoken understandings that made societies possible. When a buyer accepted a coin, he trusted not only in the metal's purity but in the system of belief that made it meaningful. When a seller offered goods on credit, he gambled on the integrity of another human being. Invisible strings wove through every market, connecting the hands of strangers through threads of faith and expectation. It was this unseen network, not the gold or the grain, that truly sustained civilization. But as this network expanded, it became more fragile. The larger the web of exchange, the thinner the trust that held it. Ancient empires, their territories vast and their markets sprawling, began to rely on symbols and rituals to sustain this delicate equilibrium. Seals, signatures, and legal codes were not mere bureaucracy, they were attempts to materialize the invisible, to give form to faith. Clay tablets, scrolls, and stamped coins were physical anchors for immaterial belief. They were assurances that even when faces were forgotten and promises stretched across generations, value would persist. Yet, even then, the ancients sensed the danger of detachment, the peril that value might drift too far from the tangible world. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote that, "Money has value only because we agree it does," a statement at once obvious and terrifying. What if the agreement faltered? What if faith dissolved? The invisible market could collapse overnight, leaving behind only the cold gleam of worthless metal. And so rituals multiplied, oaths sworn before altars, seals pressed with the images of gods and emperors, festivals marking the forgiveness of debts. These were not superstitions, they were maintenance, the spiritual upkeep of an economy of belief. In the shadow of every temple stood a marketplace, and in the heart of every market, a sacred silence, the quiet, collective breath of trust. Even now, when we imagine those ancient traders, their scales balanced under the sun, their coins clinking softly between calloused fingers, we are witnessing not just commerce but communion. Each transaction was a bridge between visible and invisible, between human and divine. And it is perhaps here, in this delicate interplay, that the true history of value lies, not in metal, not in markets, but in the fragile, flickering faith that one human being could believe in another. As the centuries turned and civilizations matured, the invisible market began to take on new and subtler forms. It was no longer bound solely to ritual or temple, no longer sustained only by the faces of rulers stamped in metal or the presence of gods invoked in trade. It became institutional, systemic, woven into the very architecture of daily life. And yet, it remained invisible, an unseen rhythm pulsing beneath the surface of things, sustaining the vast machinery of exchange. The ancients could not name it, yet they lived by it, a shared dream of equivalence, of promise made real through faith alone. It was a dream that would carry humanity from the dusty courtyards of barter to the marble halls of finance, and from the intimate to the infinite. The first great experiment in invisible value was credit. To grant credit was to believe in a future that did not yet exist, to lend not only goods but confidence. A merchant who extended credit to another was not merely trusting in repayment, he was investing in a possibility, in the unseen continuity of life and honor. This was the earliest form of abstract value, the belief that the future could be measured, promised, and, if necessary, collected. Tablets of clay from Mesopotamia record such faiths etched into permanence. So-and-so owes so much barley, they read, in simple, stoic lines, yet behind those words was a vast unseen scaffolding of trust. No guards, no locks, only the shared belief that the symbol, the mark, the word, would bind the debtor as surely as a chain. In ancient Egypt, the temples acted as proto-banks, recording offerings, loans, and repayments as part of the divine economy. To borrow from a temple was not merely a transaction, it was a covenant, a spiritual contract between human and God. Repayment was an act of devotion, default a kind of blasphemy. Here again, the invisible and the economic interwove seamlessly. The temple was both treasury and sanctuary, its priests not just keepers of rituals but accountants of faith. In the great ledgers of Thebes and Memphis, numbers and prayers mingled freely. To read them now is to glimpse a mind that did not yet distinguish between the sacred and the financial. But the invisible market's greatest evolution came when societies began to detach value from material entirely. Metal, once the anchor of trust, began to seem cumbersome, limiting. Merchants found that promises could travel farther than coins, that the spoken or written word could carry worth across oceans and empires. Letters of credit, seals of guarantee, bills of exchange, all were forms of invisible money, tokens of belief that allowed commerce to transcend geography. In the medieval world, this would become the lifeblood of trade, but its origins lay deep in antiquity. Babylonian scribes, Indian traders, Chinese merchants, all discovered the same truth, that value lived not in the object but in the agreement. In China's Tang and Song dynasties, the invisible market reached a remarkable threshold. Paper money emerged, not merely as a convenience but as a metaphysical leap. For the first time, the symbol itself was enough. A printed note, backed by the emperor's word, could circulate in place of silver. The people accepted it because they believed in the authority behind it, and that belief made it real. Yet the innovation was haunted by unease. Philosophers worried that the new abstraction might sever money's tether to the natural world. What would happen, they wondered, when the promise no longer rested on anything tangible? The answer, whispered through the centuries, was both triumph and terror. To understand this shift is to see the human mind at its most daring and fragile. For when we believe in invisible value, we are engaging in a collective act of imagination. We agree, silently and endlessly, that certain marks, weights, and words hold power. That agreement builds nations, sustains families, wages wars. It becomes a kind of secular religion, the faith that value exists even when unseen. The medieval theologians sensed this kinship. Thomas Aquinas, reflecting on usury, warned that to sell time itself was to approach the sin of hubris. To profit from the invisible was to mimic the divine, to create something from nothing. And yet, the invisible market required precisely that audacity. Humanity could not have built civilization without it. In every age, the invisible market found its symbols. In Sumer, the clay tablet; in Lydia, the coin; in China, the silk-bound note. Each object was merely the visible shell of a deeper truth, that trust, not metal, was the foundation of value. Even the empires that mastered coinage eventually learned this lesson. Rome, in its later centuries, relied increasingly on credit and taxation to sustain its armies. The soldier's pay was often promised rather than delivered, recorded in ledgers that depended on the empire's word. When that word faltered, when belief in Rome's permanence began to waver, the economy crumbled. Value did not disappear, it evaporated, like mist in sunlight, revealing the nothingness beneath. The invisible market, then, has always been an act of balance between faith and doubt. It thrives only as long as enough people believe. But belief is a volatile element. It must be nourished by ritual, renewed through repetition, enforced by authority. In ancient times, that authority was divine. The king was God's intermediary, the priest was the keeper of balance. To disbelieve in the coin was to disbelieve in the order of the cosmos itself. Later, as religion ceded ground to reason, trust shifted to law, to contract, to the solemn machinery of bureaucracy. Yet the essence remained the same, a faith in the unseen. Consider the merchant caravans that crossed the deserts of Arabia, laden with spices and cloth. They carried not only goods but trust that the paper seals they bore would be honored in cities they had never seen, by men they had never met. Each parchment, each stamped mark, was a vessel of invisible worth. To travel under its protection was to move within a network of shared imagination, a web of promises that stretched across continents. The invisible market thus became global before anyone could name it as such. It was a map of belief drawn not on paper, but in the minds of men. And yet, for all its brilliance, this invisible order carried a quiet unease. The more value drifted from the material, the more fragile it seemed. The ancients feared that invisible value could dissolve just as easily as it appeared. When a ruler's authority waned, or a temple was sacked, the promises collapsed. The coin lost its worth, the ledger its meaning. History is strewn with such moments of unraveling, when the invisible market faltered, and the world awoke to the terrifying realization that trust itself had been the true currency all along. In those times, humanity always returned, trembling, to the tangible, to gold, to grain, to earth. Yet inevitably, the cycle began anew. For once the mind learns to believe in the invisible, it can never fully return to the visible. The invisible market is, in truth, a mirror of the human soul. It reveals our hunger for meaning, our fear of loss, our longing to make permanence out of impermanence. It transforms hope into exchange, trust into measure, and memory into record. It is not simply an economic phenomenon but an ontological one, the manifestation of our ability to imagine, to project value into the void and agree that it exists. When two people meet and trade, they do more than barter goods, they affirm the existence of a shared reality, a faith that the unseen can be trusted. And so, as the world prepared to step into the modern age, with its paper notes and invisible numbers, the groundwork had long been laid. The ancient rituals of trust, the cosmic ledgers of balance, the moral weight of fairness, all these had converged into a single, silent inheritance. The invisible market, once whispered through temples and palaces, would soon encompass the globe. But its essence would remain unchanged, the quiet, precarious faith that binds all human exchange. For beneath every coin and every contract lies the same fragile truth, that value is not found in what is held, but in what is believed. In the stillness of the modern night, when the hum of electricity replaces the sound of the market and the glow of a screen substitutes for the gleam of metal, we live surrounded by the ghosts of barter. Every digital transaction, every number flickering in the dark, is the distant echo of those first quiet exchanges in the dust. We imagine ourselves far removed from the ancient world, yet we are still ruled by its unseen gods, trust, obligation, memory, and belief. Coins may have turned into digits, ledgers into algorithms, and temples into banks, but the faith that sustains them remains the same. The world of invisible value has merely deepened its spell. To understand money today is to recognize the persistence of an old dream, that something ephemeral can bind a society together. Long before credit cards and cryptographic codes, before paper and mint, there was only the whisper of mutual faith. A farmer offering grain for salt, a craftsman exchanging a blade for wool, each believed that the other's promise held weight. When we buy, sell, lend, and save, we are enacting that same ancient faith. We are, in truth, worshipping at an invisible altar, an altar to continuity, to the idea that tomorrow will honor what today has imagined. Yet the further value drifts from the tangible, the more haunting it becomes. The ancients feared the loss of measure. We fear the collapse of systems we cannot see. Invisible markets once existed between individuals, their trust intimate and face-to-face. Now they stretch through cables and satellites, connecting billions through unseen signals. The temple has become planetary. The rituals have become mechanical. But beneath the whirring code, beneath the digital abstraction of exchange, the same fragile truth persists: nothing of value exists without belief. If we look closely, the line between barter and modern finance dissolves. The ancient gift, once a gesture of human closeness, survives in the logic of debt and repayment. We give not to give, but to receive later, just as the villagers of old traded favors rather than goods. The banker's ledger is but a more intricate form of memory, the algorithm a more relentless priest. Each transaction carries the echo of obligation, the moral residue of a world that once measured worth by reciprocity, not accumulation. The language has changed, but the pulse beneath it has not. And what, then, of the coin itself, the symbol that once anchored faith in the material world? It has all but vanished, replaced by plastic, code, and invisible streams of data. Yet even now, when one holds a coin, there is something hypnotic in its weight. It is cold, circular, deliberate, an echo of the ancient desire to give shape to faith. When the hand closes around it, it is as if the centuries fold inward. You can almost feel the heat of the forge, the chant of the minting priest, the hush of the market as the first stamped discs gleamed beneath the sun. That sound, that glint, was once the heartbeat of civilization. It was a way of saying, "This we believe in." But belief, like metal, corrodes. Every age has seen its crises of faith, moments when value dissolves, when the invisible contract collapses. The fall of Rome, the inflation of the Weimar Republic, the crashes of modern markets, all are variations of an old story, the evaporation of trust. When the invisible falters, humanity seeks again the tangible. Gold bars hidden beneath floorboards, bread baked from one's own grain, the return to barter in the ruins of currency. It is as though the soul, frightened by abstraction, returns home to the earth. But only for a while. The invisible always rises again. We are creatures of imagination. We cannot resist the lure of abstraction because it reflects our deepest longing, to create something enduring out of nothing. To declare that a number, a signature, a line of code has worth is an act of defiance against impermanence. It is a quiet rebellion against decay. The ancients who first traded goods without coin were already reaching toward this transcendence. When they bartered grain for cloth, they were not just trading, they were affirming a shared fiction, that value could be held in the mind as surely as in the hand. It was the first great leap from matter to meaning. Today, that leap defines us. We no longer touch what we own. Our wealth is unseen, drifting through servers, stored in clouds. We are surrounded by symbols that refer to symbols, currencies backed not by gold, but by confidence. To some, this is progress, to others, peril. But to the historian of the invisible, it is only the continuation of a much older story. Every abstraction of value brings with it both freedom and unease. To trade without touching, to trust without seeing, is to live suspended between faith and fear. And yet, what if that is what makes us human? The invisible market, from its birth in ancient exchanges to its digital vastness today, has always mirrored the structure of the human mind. We live by signs, by meaning, by the power of shared illusion. Our economies are extensions of our collective imagination. We dream of fairness, of abundance, of stability, and we invent systems to mirror those dreams. But like dreams, they are fragile. They depend on quiet agreement, renewed each day by billions of unconscious affirmations. This has value, this means something, this will endure. The ancients would have understood. When a Sumerian scribe pressed a stylus into clay, recording a promise of grain, he was doing what we do when we click confirm purchase or sign a contract. He was fixing trust into symbol, binding the invisible to the visible. The act itself was sacred, a fusion of belief and record. The same impulse built temples, minted coins, wrote laws. To make the invisible visible, even for a moment, was to summon order from the void. And perhaps this is what civilization truly is, the persistent attempt to give form to faith. Yet there is something haunting in that ambition. For as long as we pursue invisible value, we are also pursued by it. The market does not sleep. It watches, calculates, anticipates, whispers. Its logic becomes the pulse of society, its rhythms indistinguishable from our own. We check our balances, we measure our worth, we translate our days into numbers. The invisible market has become internalized, it lives within us, guiding our choices, shaping our desires. The barter of the past was communal, but our modern exchanges often feel solitary, echoing in digital voids. The intimacy of trade has become the isolation of transaction. Perhaps that is the final transformation. The market, once an external system of exchange, has turned inward. We barter with time, with attention, with identity. Our data, our presence, our very selves have become currencies in a new invisible economy. And yet, even in this, the ancient patterns persist. We still seek recognition, reciprocation, a sense that what we give will be returned. The laws of barter endure beneath the veneer of code. Every like, every view, every transfer, is a modern echo of the same old prayer, that the unseen will remember us. If you listen carefully, you can still hear it, the murmur of the first market, the rustle of traded cloth, the soft exchange of words that bound people together long before money existed. The past is not gone, it sleeps within the present, its heartbeat faint but unbroken. The invisible market was never truly created, it was discovered, an emergent property of trust itself. And so long as humans trust, it will not die. There is a certain melancholy in knowing this. That all the progress, all the metal and paper and code, has merely refined a single, simple act, the offering of self to another through trust. From the village square to the trading floor, from the temple to the bank, from the grain ledger to the blockchain, we have never escaped the gravity of that first exchange. The means change, but the spirit endures, mysterious, fragile, human. So the story ends where it began, not with coin, nor debt, nor contract, but with belief. Before coins, before paper, before number, there was trust. Trust that tomorrow would mirror today, that a promise would hold, that another's word was worth as much as one's own. It was the first and greatest currency, the invisible thread from which all value was spun. And though we cloak it now in systems and screens, though we calculate it with precision and complexity, it remains what it always was, a quiet faith exchanged between beings uncertain of the world, yet willing to believe in one another. In that faith lies the essence of all commerce, all civilization, all meaning. For what is value, after all, but the shimmering reflection of our own desire to be understood? And what is the market but the vast mirror we have built to see that reflection multiply? The ancients might have called it sacred. Perhaps they were right. And so the story of barter ends not with the clang of coins but with silence, the silence of trust fulfilled, of promises kept, of unseen balances restored. Somewhere in that silence, beneath the hum of modern machines, you can almost hear the echo of the first trade, a gesture of giving, a murmur of belief, a soft acknowledgement that something has passed between us and that, for a moment, it was enough.